Imagine a world where a country's ability to provide healthcare isn't decided by its own government, but by a foreign power thousands of miles away. Sounds unbelievable, right? But that's exactly the reality for many African nations, where hospitals and clinics rely heavily on aid from the United States. Sounds surprising, right? But here's the thing. America played its cards smart. They stepped in as the hero, providing funding to fight diseases like HIV, malaria, and tuberculosis. At first glance, it seemed like a generous move, but in reality, it created something else: dependence. Over time, African healthcare systems became hooked on US aid, like a lifeline they couldn't let go of. And with that dependency came a hidden catch. No African leader could dare challenge the United States without consequences. If they did, the aid could be pulled overnight, leaving the sick and vulnerable to suffer. And now, that's exactly what's happening. With Trump slashing nearly all US funding to South Africa and cutting 90% of USAID worldwide, many African countries are teetering on the edge of a healthcare disaster. Their leaders, despite being aligned with the West, never invested in their own hospitals. Now they're scrambling. But in the middle of this crisis, one man is taking a completely different path. Captain Ibrahim Traoré sees this as a turning point, a moment to break free from reliance on foreign aid once and for all. Instead of begging for handouts, he's doing something no other African leader has dared to attempt. He's launching 55 ultra-modern hospitals, designed not just to serve Burkina Faso, but to become a medical hub for the entire continent. But how did he pull this off when so many others failed? And why is this move so groundbreaking? To understand that, we first need to look at how Africa's healthcare system was set up to be dependent in the first place. For decades, Western nations have built a system that ensures Africa remains at their mercy when it comes to healthcare. They've structured it so that instead of developing its own hospitals, medical schools, and pharmaceutical industries, Africa remains a buyer, always needing to import drugs, equipment, and expertise from abroad. International financial institutions like the IMF and World Bank have played their part too, making sure that African governments remain under strict economic policies that prevent them from prioritising healthcare. Meanwhile, foreign aid programs keep hospitals afloat, but never let them stand on their own. It's a cycle designed to maintain control, but Traoré is ripping up that script. Instead of waiting for outside help, he's proving that Africa doesn't need to be a permanent charity case. He's investing national resources into healthcare, making sure Burkina Faso and its neighbours don't have to rely on Western approval to save lives. For years, the world has been told the same story. Africa is too poor to take care of itself. It's a continent in desperate need of help, unable to build hospitals, manufacture medicine, or run a proper healthcare system without foreign aid. But what if that's not true? What if the real issue isn't a lack of money, but a lack of leadership and control over its own resources? This is exactly what Ibrahim Traoré is proving right now. While many African leaders continue to rely on outside help, he's showing that Africa has everything it needs to build a thriving healthcare system, except the freedom to do so. And to truly understand why his actions are groundbreaking, we need to uncover how Africa was deliberately locked into a cycle of dependency. This didn't just happen by chance. It was built carefully, strategically, and intentionally. And it was done using three main tactics: blocking Africa from producing its own medicine, tying healthcare funding to political conditions, and prioritising foreign organisations over local health systems. Let's start with medicine. Africa is home to an abundance of natural resources needed to make life-saving drugs. From plants used in traditional medicine to raw materials for pharmaceutical production, the continent has everything necessary to become self-sufficient. Yet, African countries still import over 70% of their medicines. Why? Because Western-controlled financial institutions like the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank have made sure of it. These organisations didn't just lend money to African countries, they set the rules. In exchange for loans, they forced governments to privatise key industries, including pharmaceuticals, making it nearly impossible for African nations to develop large-scale drug production facilities. Take Nigeria, for example. In the 1980s, the country had one of the strongest pharmaceutical industries in Africa, with local companies producing essential medicines for the population. But then came the IMF's so-called economic reforms. The Nigerian government was pressured into selling off state-owned pharmaceutical firms and removing trade barriers that protected local industries. The result? A flood of cheap foreign drugs from Western and Indian companies, which wiped out local manufacturers. Today, Nigeria imports the majority of its medicine, and its once thriving pharmaceutical sector has never recovered. Ghana faced a similar fate. In the 1990s, the World Bank pushed the Ghanaian government to lower tariffs on imported drugs. They claimed it would increase competition, but in reality it crushed local pharmaceutical companies, leaving the country dependent on foreign medicine. And it's not just West Africa, even South Africa, with the most advanced pharmaceutical industry on the continent, wasn't spared. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the country's Biovac Institute was ready to produce its own vaccines. It had the facilities, the expertise, and the resources. But there was one problem. Western pharmaceutical companies refused to share patents and production technology. Even though South Africa could have manufactured vaccines for itself and the continent, it was forced to buy them instead. And that's not a coincidence, it's a strategy designed to keep Africa in a position where it always has to rely on others for medical supplies. Imagine needing life-saving medicine, but the only way to get it is by agreeing to rules set by someone thousands of miles away. That's exactly how many African countries are forced to operate when it comes to healthcare. On the surface, foreign aid for healthcare might seem like a generous gift, but behind the scenes, it often comes with strings attached, strings that give Western countries the power to dictate policies in African nations. Instead of helping Africa stand on its own, this system keeps it dependent, ensuring that any country that dares to challenge Western influence risks losing critical healthcare funding. Take Burkina Faso, for example. In 2023, after Captain Ibrahim Traoré expelled Western military forces and strengthened ties with Russia, the US responded by slashing millions of dollars in healthcare aid. The message was clear: step out of line, and we'll pull the plug on your medical funding. But Traoré didn't back down. Instead of begging for foreign assistance, he took matters into his own hands, building hospitals with Burkina Faso's own resources. Uganda faced a similar situation. When the government passed laws that went against certain Western cultural policies, the reaction was swift. The US and the European Union threatened to cut off healthcare funding, putting millions of Ugandans at risk, especially those dependent on foreign-backed HIV and AIDS treatment programs. In this case, healthcare wasn't just about saving lives. It was used as leverage to force political compliance. And then there's Zimbabwe. In the early 2000s, the country launched land reform policies that angered Western governments. The response? Economic sanctions so severe that Zimbabwe's healthcare system was practically strangled. Medical imports became nearly impossible. Hospitals ran out of supplies and the entire system was pushed to the brink of collapse. But instead of acknowledging that these sanctions caused the crisis, the West framed Zimbabwe's struggling healthcare as a failure of African leadership, when in reality it was a deliberate act of economic warfare. This pattern isn't a coincidence, it's a strategy. If you are still watching this video, it means you love it. Why not take out a second and hit that like button? Have you done that? Let us move on. Another strategy the West has used to ensure Africa's healthcare remains fragmented and dependent on aid is by prioritising foreign NGOs over African governments. Instead of supporting national healthcare programs, the West has flooded the continent with Western-controlled NGOs, which create temporary healthcare solutions, but prevent long-term national healthcare development. These organisations function as a parallel system, where foreign groups, not African governments, provide medical services, ensuring that Africa never develops a centralised healthcare structure. The Gates Foundation is a prime example of how Western NGOs control Africa's healthcare narrative. While the foundation is praised for funding vaccination programs, it ensures that Africa remains dependent on Western pharmaceutical companies. Rather than investing in local vaccine production, Gates-funded programs purchase vaccines from Western firms, keeping Western corporations in control of profits, while Africa remains dependent on imports. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, Doctors Without Borders runs independent medical programs, often without coordination with the government. While their services provide short-term relief, they also undermine national healthcare development. Rather than strengthening DRC's health infrastructure, these foreign-run hospitals create a system where local doctors remain underpaid and undertrained. ensuring permanent dependence on Western aid. Ibrahim Traoré's response to this system of dependency has been revolutionary. By building 55 modern hospitals using Burkina Faso's own resources, he has proven that Africa does not need Western aid to build world-class healthcare infrastructure. His model directly challenges the entire neo-colonial system of healthcare control, showing that Africa can fund, operate and sustain its own medical industry without begging for Western assistance. By building 55 modern hospitals using Burkina Faso's own resources, instead of importing overpriced drugs, his administration is investing in domestic pharmaceutical production. So Burkina Faso no longer needs to rely on Western companies. Instead of accepting political conditions on healthcare funding, he is funding his hospitals through national resources, ensuring that Burkina Faso's medical policies serve the Burkinabe people, not Western interests. Africa's healthcare system isn't weak because of a lack of money or resources. It's weak because of a carefully designed structure that keeps it dependent on foreign aid. And one of the biggest tools used to maintain this control, Western-backed NGOs. Rather than strengthening national healthcare programs, these organizations flood African countries with temporary solutions that keep them reliant on outside assistance. Instead of allowing African governments to build their own medical systems, these NGOs operate like a parallel structure, one where foreign groups, not African leaders, decide how and where healthcare is provided, running hospitals and clinics with little to no coordination with the government. While their services provide short-term help, they also weaken the country's ability to build its own healthcare system. With foreign doctors taking the lead, local medical professionals remain underpaid, undertrained, and dependent on outside funding. The result? A country that never gains full control over its own healthcare. But while most African leaders accept this system, Captain Ibrahim Traoré is doing the exact opposite. Instead of relying on foreign aid, he's proving that Africa can build its own world-class medical infrastructure without begging for outside help. In Burkina Faso, he's spearheading the construction of 55 modern hospitals, fully funded with national resources. He's not waiting for Western approval, loans or donations. He's showing that African countries can finance, operate and sustain their own healthcare systems without being trapped by foreign interests. But hospitals alone aren't enough. To truly break free, Traoré is also investing in domestic pharmaceutical production. Instead of importing overpriced drugs from Western companies, Burkina Faso is shifting towards producing its own medicine, ensuring that the country no longer has to rely on external suppliers. And while many African leaders claim they can't build modern healthcare systems due to a lack of funds, Traoré is proving otherwise. Yes, Burkina Faso's natural resources are a major source of funding, but that's not the only reason this plan is working. One of Traoré's most groundbreaking decisions has been redirecting government spending from excessive military contracts into public health initiatives. For years, African nations have spent billions on security agreements with Western defence contractors. These deals have fueled conflicts rather than resolving them, keeping Africa dependent on foreign military aid while draining national budgets. Recognising this pattern, Traoré renegotiated Burkina Faso's military contracts, cutting ties with defence firms that profited from instability. Instead of funneling money into endless security deals, he prioritised his own country's defence forces while shifting funds toward hospitals, medical equipment and healthcare training programmes. Ibrahim Traoré is rewriting the rules of governance, proving that a country doesn't need to be rich. It just needs leaders who put the people first. Instead of waiting for handouts or bowing to Western financial institutions, Traoré is making bold financial decisions that redirect Burkina Faso's wealth where it truly matters. One of his biggest moves? Overhauling government spending to free up resources for healthcare. For years, top officials in Burkina Faso enjoyed lavish perks, outrageous salaries, luxury vehicles, endless foreign trips, and diplomatic events that achieved little for ordinary citizens. But under Traoré's leadership, the wasteful spending has been cut. Unnecessary travel, gone. Expensive government projects that serve no real purpose, scrapped. Every dollar saved is now being funneled into strengthening the country's healthcare system. And the results speak for themselves. Burkina Faso, a nation long dismissed as too poor to develop, is now constructing some of the most advanced hospitals in West Africa without a single cent of Western aid. But the real game changer isn't just the hospitals, it's where the funding is coming from. For decades, Burkina Faso has been sitting on a fortune. The country is one of the largest gold producers in the world, yet its people remain some of the poorest in Africa. Why? Because Western corporations controlled the mining industry, extracting billions of dollars in gold, uranium, and other resources, while Burkina Faso was left with nothing but empty promises. This is a story that plays out across Africa, resource-rich nations signing exploitative contracts that allow foreign companies to take the wealth, while local hospitals, schools, and infrastructure crumble. But Traoré has changed the script. His administration has introduced sweeping reforms that prevent foreign companies from permanently owning Burkina Faso's mineral-rich land. Every mining contract has been renegotiated, ensuring that a much larger share of the revenue stays within the country. And for the first time in history, Burkina Faso's gold wealth is being used for its own people. These funds are no longer lining the pockets of foreign shareholders. They're building hospitals, training doctors, and laying the foundation for a self-sufficient healthcare system. This stands in stark contrast to countries like Nigeria and Angola, where leaders sell off national resources at bargain prices, only to turn around and plead for Western aid to fix the very problems they helped create. But Traoré isn't stopping with hospitals. He's tackling an even bigger problem, the pharmaceutical stranglehold that has kept African countries dependent on overpriced Western medicines. For years, major pharmaceutical companies have controlled Africa's access to life-saving drugs. They refuse to share patents, enforce strict trade restrictions, and manipulate global health policies to ensure that Africa remains a consumer, not a producer. Instead of allowing this cycle to continue, Traoré is investing in something revolutionary: Burkina Faso's first large-scale pharmaceutical production facility. This factory won't just make medicine cheaper for Burkinabe citizens, it will break the West's grip on the country's healthcare system entirely. By manufacturing its own generic drugs at a fraction of the cost, Burkina Faso will no longer be forced to buy from Western pharmaceutical giants that dictate prices and supply. The country will be able to produce the medicine it needs, when it needs it, without waiting for foreign approval. His bold healthcare initiative could turn the country into a major producer of affordable medicine, cutting Africa's reliance on expensive foreign imports. But hospitals alone aren't enough. Traoré knows that healthcare can't just be limited to big cities, while rural communities struggle to access even the most basic medical care. That's why his government has taken an innovative approach, deploying fully equipped mobile hospitals to bring treatment directly to people in remote and conflict-affected areas. In many African countries, healthcare is concentrated in urban centres, leaving millions in villages and rural towns with no choice but to travel long distances for a simple doctor's visit. The result? Sky-high maternal and infant mortality rates, preventable disease outbreaks, and a widening gap between those who can afford medical care and those who can't. Traoré's mobile hospitals are changing that. Instead of forcing citizens to come to healthcare, healthcare is coming to them. These state-of-the-art medical units, staffed by highly trained Burkinabe doctors and nurses, are reaching people who have been overlooked for decades. And unlike the Western-backed NGOs that have long dominated African healthcare, these mobile hospitals are fully owned and operated by Burkina Faso. They aren't short-term charity projects or temporary aid missions. They are part of a long-term strategy to build a self-sufficient healthcare system that doesn't depend on outside help. But here's the part that's making Western powers uneasy. It's working. Traoré has already launched 55 ultra-modern hospitals, completely free from Western loans or financial backing. His success is proving that African nations don't need to depend on foreign aid to build world-class healthcare infrastructure. And that's a problem for the West. For decades, Africa has been trapped in a cycle of dependency, forced to accept foreign aid in exchange for political control. If Burkina Faso succeeds, it will set a powerful example for other African countries. Leaders across the continent will have no excuse to continue relying on Western donors while sitting on vast natural resources that could fund their own development. The question now isn't whether Burkina Faso can stand on its own. It already is. The real question is whether other African leaders will rise to the challenge or keep handing over their country's futures in exchange for foreign scraps. If you found this video interesting, be sure to hit that like button and don't forget to subscribe.